So our first author, Bertolt Lask, also writing under the pseudonym Gerhard Wieland, was a German Jewish author and journalist who joined the Communist Party in 1923. She was, as many of her generation, personally affected by the war in which both of her brothers died. She was a vocal supporter of the women's movement, criticized the chauvinist culture that led to war, and was a vehement critic of the unbridled capitalism that had punished so many families during the period of hyperinflation in the early 20s. Her work was banned, seen as too polemical, and she was eventually forced into exile when the Nazis took power. In our story here, The Boy Who Wanted to Fight with a Dragon from 1921, we can see her fighting these injustices that would preoccupy her for most of her life. In her tale, we can see how she could have imagined a conversation with her brothers who she had just lost in the war. They echo the thoughtless desire of many young Germans earlier who, when I grow up, I want to go and kill all the French. That sentiment alongside of a dangerous nationalism there that was embedded in chauvinism, in which girls can't kill dragons, excludes her from joining him. But after identifying the desire to vanquish an enemy, she goes deeper and points out how in freeing the damsel in distress, the young boy would have to destroy the sewing machine. She's enslaved by the very thing that earns her enough to be able to survive, which provides the fine suits to the upper class, demonstrating there is a systemic problem here. Just as the dragon is the embodiment of greed in the medieval legend, the new dragon of greed is the industrial machines that facilitate the exploitation of labor as the black smoke puffs out of his nose. That's the dragon. He drags me away from my children every day. And yet this dragon is the one that has provided the young boy the coat that keeps him warm. Lask goes even further to point out that attacking the machinery is not the actual evil itself, but rather the real dragon that causes evil keeps on hiding. Unlike the medieval legend, the young boy never recognizes his own role in perpetuating the evil, that he benefits directly from the inequality that he is, in fact, the very evil he seeks to destroy with his heroic posturing. Lask confronts her audience with the face of poverty and the systemic causes behind these, but despite this approach, she is also hopeful in providing a utopian alternative through the voice of the young girl who redefines the heroic by pointing out the hypocrisy of the young boy and offering compassion and solidarity as loftier goals. The story provides insight into how class exploitation works and is really rather critical of the brutality of war. And next we have Joachim Ringelnatz, which is the pen name for Hans Böttcher, who takes a different approach. Böttcher was a cabaretist, which is a type of stand-up comedian. He's perhaps even more well-known for his paintings that were censored by the Nazi regime as degenerate art later in his career. Böttcher undermines the fairy tale by deconstructing it and the image of the folk that the middle class idealizes. In Kuttel Daddledoo tells his children the fairy tale about Little Red Cap from 1923. He begins by pointing out how the fairy tale is appropriated politically to indoctrinate values and mores with a retelling that was told to me long ago when I was still little and dumb like you are now. Because his audience would mostly be adults who like the wordplay and adult themes, the drunkard uncle character is crude in his description of Little Red Riding Hood as a beautiful girl, red as blood, white as snow, and as he goes on to objectify her within the context of the character. He plays with the expectations of the audience, often pointing out logical problems of the genre and the general plot. For instance, when Little Red gives the wolf the exact address of her grandmother, otherwise, how would he ever know where to rush off to ahead of her? And then again, he purposely begins to blend the tales together, equating the passive female protagonist as exchangeable. The wolf can trick the grandmother by first disguising his voice, which should have tipped off the grandmother, and then second, by getting the name wrong as he answered, "It's me, Sleeping Beauty." And then another plot twist. The grandmother eats the wolf up and then ate Little Red Cap all up and then ate the hunter too, so that he turns the entire genre on its head, playing all the while with the audience's expectations, leaving them without a satisfying ending at all. Heinrich Schultz, however, is best known as an educational reformer who introduced a form of shorthand and for his political engagement. While Lask's tale is polemical, pointing out systemic inequalities, and Böttcher's fable brims with satire, Schultz would write with a more generalized didactic goal in his mind in his The Castle with the Windows from 1924. He follows the three-part structure of the Grimm fairy tale that leads the ruler to different perspectives of the society. The red valorizes his group, the blue makes a different group look smaller, like they are less, and the third gray window is used to justify the dehumanized laborers of the city. Schultz can convey the process of prejudice and racism in the perspectives of the castle. The fly, the smallest of creatures, then irritates the most socially powerful king, demonstrating how everyone is subject to similar frustrations in life. The fly does not respect where he lies on the social hierarchy, and despite his power to rule and judge, he is unable to vanquish a fly, and this leads him to breaking the glass and seeing how the gray are actually much bigger and stronger than the glass has allowed them to be seen. And then the blue are much happier than he had viewed them also, while his own group looked to be much more feeble and conceited in their self-aggrandizing view and lens of themselves. The happy end of Schultz's tale is really not an end at all, but rather a cover-up of the reality behind the panes of glass. The happy end results only in the denial of reality and the reestablishment of the order in which he can see himself as better than the others, rather than connect with them and appreciate them. Then finally, we have Felix Fechenbach, who was a German Jewish journalist who grew up in poverty, fought in the First World War, and then thereafter became a pacifist and political advisor and part of the group that overthrew the Bavarian monarchy in 1918. He would eventually be imprisoned for his political activities, and then later, when the Nazis took power, he was arrested for his anti-fascist writings and eventually executed by the SS and SA in 1933. His tale, The Triumph of the Wolves from 1925, is a direct critique of how the fledgling Nazi party attempted a coup in 1923 known as the Bierhall-Putsch to take over the Weimar democracy. In his tale, he points to the secret pacts and conspiracies of the far right to use the very mechanisms of democracy to establish their own autocratic dictatorship through the unwillingness to prosecute the threats and continue to tolerate and promote these political views in the courts and judicial system. Hitler, while being found guilty of treason and receiving a 5-year sentence, he was also lauded by the judge who shared in his authoritarian political views. And then after having served only 9 months, Hitler's sentence was commuted and he was released. It was soon thereafter that Fechenbach wrote his tale. Hitler had then decided to destroy the democracy through legal and propagandistic means. The allegorical lion represents the old authoritarian monarchy of the German Empire, with the new wolves being the rising fascist party, who prop Hitler up as a new form of monarchist, albeit a populist, quasi-religious leader to whom all must make an oath of fealty. Fechenbach, who was jailed in 1922 for his anti-fascist writings, was wrongfully sentenced by a court that no longer existed under the Weimar democracy. But all the same, he was imprisoned and until he could be pardoned by a higher court. He foresaw the slide to the right, even as the domestic animals won their freedom. Rather than replace those who had been part of the monarchy with new judges and prosecutors, they allowed the system to remain intact in the form of the bearers of that old ideology. The donkeys, known for their stubbornness, argue against change because of tradition. And unaware of the coming coup, the wolves and jackals all then legally prosecute the domestic animals for high treason and gobble them up and then return the lion to the throne. The tale resembles the portrayal of the cat and the companionship of the cat and the mouse, while including the ominous allegorical foresight of the coming end of the Weimar democracy by the rising far-right conspiracy. The experimentation with political fairy tales in the early 1920s ultimately failed in this decade, though it would be taken up again much later towards the end of the century and meet with much more better success. There were several factors that kept the tales from really catching on at this time, the primary one being that the tales were a form of literature, and this was primarily the domain of the middle class. The fact that they were politically motivated made them controversial enough to be left out of school and library holdings, and most political groups also shifted away from the writing and publishing of these tales and much more towards oral tales and songs after 1926. There was also a stronger preference for the Grimm versions of the tales with their distractions and without the didactics. since the reading of the tales was sometimes too conceptual for the young and the format too naive for adults. When the Nazis came into power, all experimentation with media was banned, especially tales that had a very direct political message. Even those characters who were representing role models, such as Sherlock Holmes, the intellectual, that went against their policy were banned. During this period, stories had to glorify Germany as a special nation so that these tales would have to wait until the educational reforms of 1968 before they would be rediscovered by a new generation of authors and become a mainstay of children's literature thereafter.